I had barely signed for the certified envelope when my phone started ringing. Unknown number. I ignored it. The return address on the envelope caught my attention first. Law offices of Michael Harlan, my mother's attorney. For 3 years my parents hadn't spoken to me. No birthday card, no holiday message, no apology, nothing except a few relatives trying to guilt me into being the bigger person. Now their attorney was writing to me. I opened the envelope, expecting bad news. Maybe my mother was sick. Maybe someone had died. Maybe this was finally the apology that should have happened years ago. Instead, the cover letter said only one thing. Please sign the enclosed document to finalize an outstanding family matter. I frowned. No explanation. No acknowledgement of the last 3 years. Just a sign. I turned the page. Halfway through the first paragraph, I blinked. By the second page, I read it again. By the third, I burst into laughter so hard I had to sit down at my kitchen table before I dropped the papers. My phone rang again. Same number. Still laughing, I answered. There was a long pause before a calm voice asked, "Ms. Brooks, are you all right?" I couldn't answer immediately because every sentence in that document somehow made the whole situation even more ridiculous. 3 years of silence. 3 years of pretending I didn't exist. And this was how my mother finally decided to reach out. Not through a phone call. Not through an apology. Through legal paperwork. My husband, Ethan, looked up from the living room when he heard me laughing. "I thought it was bad news," he said. "So did I." "What happened?" I slid the papers across the table toward him, but kept one finger on the first page. "I think someone made a very expensive mistake. 3 years earlier, I had made the hardest decision of my life. I stopped talking to my parents. People love to imagine that going no contact happens after one giant explosion. For me, it happened after hundreds of smaller ones. Every family dinner somehow became about my younger brother, Kyle. If he forgot a birthday, everyone laughed. If I missed a dinner because of work, I was accused of not caring about family. If Kyle made a reckless financial decision, my parents called it learning. If I questioned anything, I was jealous. The rules were never the same for both of us. They changed depending on who was being judged. When Ethan proposed, I honestly believed things might finally improve. Instead, my mother looked him in the eye and said words I'd never forget. "He's a mistake you'll regret." My father didn't disagree. He just stared at the floor. When I asked if they planned to come to the wedding anyway, my mother shrugged. "We won't support something we know will fail." They never came. Our wedding photos have an empty space where my parents should have been. A week later, relatives started calling. Not to ask how I was. Not to congratulate us. To tell me I should stop being selfish. Apparently, my parents had already explained everything. According to them, I had abandoned the family over one little disagreement. No one asked for my side. Eventually, I stopped trying to defend myself. I blocked numbers. Ignored messages. Built a quiet life with Ethan that didn't revolve around chasing approval I was never going to receive. Then, exactly 3 years later, a lawyer mailed me paperwork asking for my signature as though nothing had happened. I looked back at the document. One sentence jumped out immediately. It described conversations I had never had and decisions I had never made. This wasn't just insulting. Something about it was legally wrong. Before I could finish reading the next page, the attorney spoke again through the phone. "Ms. Brooks, could you tell me what exactly you found so funny?" I took a breath, trying to stop laughing long enough to answer. "I'm sorry," I said. "I'm not laughing at you, I'm laughing because, have you actually read what you sent me?" There was a brief silence. "I've reviewed the signature page," the attorney replied carefully. "Is there a problem with the document?" "I think there are several. He hesitated. Would you mind explaining? I will, I said, glancing back at the first page. But first, I need to understand why you think I would ever sign something like this. After we ended the call, I spread every page across my dining room table. Ethan sat beside me, quietly reading. Neither of us spoke for almost a minute. Finally, he looked up. This doesn't sound like you at all. It isn't. Every sentence pulled me backward through memories I'd spent 3 years trying to leave behind. Growing up, Kyle always had an excuse. If he forgot Mother's Day, Mom would smile and say, "He's just busy." If he borrowed money and never repaid it, Dad would call him unlucky. When I worked overtime and missed one Sunday dinner, I was accused of putting strangers ahead of my family. Whenever I pointed out the double standard, my mother would shake her head. "You're keeping score again." Kyle would grin from across the table. "You've always been dramatic, Nat." No one challenged him. Eventually, I stopped expecting anyone to. Things only became worse after Ethan entered my life. The first time I introduced him to my parents, he brought flowers for my mother and spent nearly an hour helping my father repair a loose fence gate. As we drove home, Ethan smiled. I think that went pretty well. I didn't have the heart to tell him what happened after he'd stepped outside to answer a work call. My mother folded her arms and said flatly, "He's polite, but he's still a mistake." I stared at her. What does that even mean? It means you're settling. Dad stayed silent. Kyle laughed into his drink. I waited for anyone, to tell her she'd gone too far. Nobody did. Over the next several months, every wedding conversation turned into another argument. My mother criticized the venue. She criticized the guest list. She criticized the date. Then she criticized the marriage itself. One evening I finally said, "You don't have to like my decisions, I just want you there." She didn't even pretend to think about it. "I won't celebrate a marriage that's doomed." Dad looked uncomfortable but never contradicted her. Kyle shrugged. "Guess that settles it." The wedding came and went without them. Friends asked where my parents were. I smiled for the photographs anyway. After the honeymoon, my phone filled with messages from relatives. "I heard you pushed your parents away. They're heartbroken. You only get one family." Every conversation began with the assumption that I was the one who had caused the divide. No one asked why my parents skipped their own daughter's wedding. No one mentioned what they'd said about Ethan. Someone had already written the story, and everyone else accepted it without question. Eventually, I stopped correcting people. Blocking numbers was easier than defending myself to people who had already chosen what to believe. 3 years later, I looked down at the attorney's paperwork again. One paragraph claimed I had voluntarily discussed stepping away from all future family matters. Another referred to an agreement I supposedly understood years ago. I tapped the page. "Ethan, I have never seen this before." "I know," he replied. "And if I've never seen it?" I read the paragraph a third time, slower than before. The wording wasn't just unfair. It described events that had never happened. I looked toward my phone, now resting silently on the table. Only one question kept repeating in my mind. Why would an attorney send paperwork containing statements that I knew were objectively false? The next morning, I called Michael Harlan's office before I could talk myself out of it. His receptionist transferred me almost immediately. "Ms. Brooks," he said, "I'm glad you called back." "I have questions." "So do I," he admitted. "I was under the impression this paperwork reflected an arrangement your family had already discussed." "It doesn't." There was a pause. "I've never seen these documents before yesterday," I continued. "I've never agreed to anything in them, and I certainly haven't had any of the conversations they're describing." His voice became more cautious. "You're saying this is your first time reviewing the file?" "Yes, I see." He no longer sounded as confident as he had the day before. I flipped to the second page. Can we start with this paragraph? It says I voluntarily declined any future interest in family assets and acknowledged my brother as the sole successor. Yes, I never said that. You never discussed that with your mother? No. Or with your father? No. Or with anyone from this office? Never. Silence filled the line. Then I heard papers shuffling. Please give me a moment. For nearly a minute, all I could hear was the sound of folders opening and pages turning. When he came back, his tone had changed completely. Ms. Brooks, may I ask when you last spoke with your mother? 3 years ago. And there has been no communication since. None. I was informed the family had reached an understanding shortly after that. I let out a quiet laugh. The only understanding was that I stopped letting them mistreat me. Another long pause. I appreciate your honesty, he said. But that's not what you've been told, is it? No. He didn't answer. He didn't have to. For the first time, I realized this wasn't just a misunderstanding between relatives. Someone had presented my silence as cooperation. That single assumption had somehow found its way into official legal paperwork. I opened another attachment. It referenced a meeting date. I checked my calendar history on my laptop. That afternoon, I had been in another state attending a work conference with Ethan. There couldn't have been a family meeting. I took a screenshot of my travel itinerary, hotel confirmation, and conference registration. I'd like to email you something, I said. What is it? Proof I wasn't even in town on the date listed in your attachment. His reply came quietly. Please send it immediately. Within minutes I attached every document I had. He confirmed they had arrived. I waited while he reviewed them. I see airline records, he muttered. Hotel receipts. Conference registration. Another pause. Those dates are correct, I said. They are. So whatever conversation this attachment refers to. Couldn't have happened, he finished. My stomach tightened. This wasn't just about being excluded anymore. Someone had built an official timeline around events that never took place. The attorney began checking additional documents in the file. I could hear frustration creeping into his voice. One moment. More pages turned. Then he stopped. That's odd. What is? I'm looking at an internal reference that cites supporting notes. And I don't have those notes. You mean they're missing? I mean this document says they exist, but they aren't in the file. He searched again. Nothing. Then he found another inconsistency. The dates on 2 forms didn't match. A witness reference pointed to paperwork created months later. The sequence simply didn't make sense. His confidence was gone. Ms. Brooks, he said slowly, I need you to do one thing. What? Do not sign anything. I wasn't planning to. I'm serious. So am I. He took a steady breath before continuing. I need to review the entire file immediately. Until I understand how these inconsistencies occurred, nothing should move forward. 2 days passed before Michael Harlan called again. This time, his voice carried none of the confidence from our first conversation. Ms. Brooks, do you have a few minutes? I do. I've completed a much more thorough review of the file. I sat down at the kitchen table, the same place where I had first opened the envelope. I'm listening. There are multiple internal contradictions throughout the documents, he said, enough that I cannot safely proceed with what I was asked to finalize. I glanced at Ethan, who had been pretending to read but was clearly listening. What kind of contradictions? The paperwork assumes facts that are not supported by the file itself. He paused before continuing. Some statements reference conversations for which there is no documentation. Other portions rely on dates that conflict with verified records. There are also acknowledgements attributed to you without any evidence that you ever received or reviewed the underlying material. So the document doesn't even support itself. That's one way to put it. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then all the scattered pieces from the past 3 years began fitting together. My parents hadn't simply told relatives I walked away because I was selfish. They needed people to believe that version. If everyone accepted that I had voluntarily removed myself from the family, then nobody would question paperwork suggesting I had willingly stepped aside. The story they'd repeated at birthdays, holidays, and family gatherings wasn't just gossip anymore. It had become part of the foundation they expected everyone, including their attorney, to accept. "I think I understand now," I said quietly. "What do you mean?" "They spent years making sure everyone believed I chose this. I can't speak to their intentions." "I know, but I can." He didn't argue. Instead, he said, "From a legal standpoint, your refusal to sign means this matter cannot be completed as drafted." That single sentence shifted everything. 3 years earlier, I had been the daughter nobody believed. Now I was the one person whose signature actually mattered. Later that afternoon, my cousin Melissa texted me for the first time in over a year. "Is everything okay? I heard there's some issue with your mom's estate." I stared at the message. Word had already started spreading. I answered carefully. "I'm fine, there are legal questions being sorted out." Nothing more. Within hours, 2 more relatives reached out. Neither accused me of being selfish. Neither demanded that I apologize. Instead, they asked vague questions about paperwork, meetings, and whether I had been contacted recently. For the first time in years, the conversation inside the family had changed. People weren't criticizing me. They were trying to understand what had happened. Meanwhile, Michael told me he had received several calls from my brother, Kyle. He wanted to know why everything had stopped, Michael said. "What did you tell him?" "Only that I was reviewing the file. I couldn't discuss anything further." "And my parents?" "They've also been informed that additional review is necessary." I imagined my mother realizing the plan hadn't quietly reached the finish line. Not because I had started a fight. Not because I had hired my own attorney. Because I had simply read what they mailed me. The irony almost made me laugh again. Before ending the call, Michael spoke more slowly than usual. "Ms. Brooks, yes, I've handled estate matters for a long time. I figured. I've also seen clients make assumptions that don't hold up once documents are carefully examined." I waited. Then he said the sentence that stayed with me long after we hung up. "I think your mother assumed you'd never actually read this." The following week, I met Michael Harlan in person. He greeted me professionally, but there was a noticeable difference from our first phone call. When he had mailed the documents, he believed he was wrapping up routine paperwork. Now he understood he had uncovered something entirely different. After we sat down, he placed a neatly organized file on the conference table. "I wanted to explain exactly what I found," he said. I nodded. He opened the files. "Your mother's estate plan transferred nearly everything to your brother. That's perfectly legal if done properly." "I never expected equal treatment," I replied. "That isn't what bothered me." "I understand." He turned another page. "The problem isn't who received the assets." "It isn't." "No." He pointed to several sections, highlighted with colored tabs. "The documents repeatedly state that you voluntarily removed yourself from any future claims and understood the arrangement." "I never did." "Correct." He slid another page toward me. "There is no properly executed waiver from you. Instead, these documents rely on statements that assume your agreement." He looked directly at me. "And several of those statements are contradicted by the file itself." I remembered the paragraph that had made me laugh. "So the paperwork defeated itself." "In practical terms, yes. He explained that some dates conflicted with verified records, while other sections referred to conversations that had no supporting documentation. References to meetings couldn't be reconciled with the timeline, and the signature page he had mailed me was intended to complete a process that hadn't been properly established in the first place. If you had simply signed, he said, the inconsistencies might never have been questioned. But I read every page. You did. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then I laughed again. Not because anyone was losing money. Not because my mother was embarrassed. I laughed because for years I had been painted as unreasonable, emotional, and impossible to deal with. Yet the one thing that unraveled the entire situation was taking the time to read a document before signing it. Michael smiled politely. I have to admit, he said, when you laughed on the phone I thought something was terribly wrong. I suppose something was. He nodded. Just not with you. Before I left he apologized. I regret that my office became part of this. You didn't know. No, but I still wanted to say it. I appreciate that. When he asked whether I intended to sign any revised documents in the future, my answer came easily. No. There was nothing left to negotiate. 3 years earlier, I had already accepted that I wasn't going to receive my parents' approval. I certainly wasn't going to help validate a story that had never been true. Over the next month, the estate process stalled. Without my signature, the defective paperwork couldn't move forward in its existing form. From what Michael later confirmed, the records would have to be corrected before anything else could happen. That meant confronting the inconsistencies instead of pretending they didn't exist. News traveled through the family much faster than I expected. Melissa called first. I owe you an apology. For what? I believed everything Aunt Diane told us. She sounded genuinely ashamed. I thought you had walked away over nothing. I know. I never asked your side. You weren't the only one. A few days later, another cousin reached out. Then an uncle. The conversations weren't dramatic. No one suddenly became my best friend. But the questions had changed. Instead of asking why I abandoned my parents, they wanted to know why I had never been consulted about documents that claimed I had agreed to everything. For years, my mother controlled the family's version of events. Now the paperwork itself had forced people to question that version. Kyle never contacted me directly. According to Michael, he remained frustrated that everything had been delayed, but the attorney refused to discuss confidential matters beyond what was necessary. For once, Kyle couldn't rely on the story everyone had always accepted without question. My parents also lost something they had protected for years. Their credibility. Not because I launched a public campaign against them. Not because I argued with relatives. Because the official records didn't match the story they had been telling. I never celebrated that. There wasn't any satisfaction in watching a family fall apart. What I did feel was relief. The burden of constantly defending myself was finally gone. I no longer needed to convince anyone that my decision to go no contact had been justified. The evidence had spoken for itself. Life settled back into the quiet rhythm Ethan and I had built over those 3 years. We cooked dinner together, spent weekends with friends who actually enjoyed our company, made plans that didn't revolve around family drama. The attorney's letter went into a filing cabinet with the rest of our important documents. I hoped I'd never need to look at it again. It had already served its purpose. 3 years of silence had protected my peace. One unexpected letter had protected my reputation. After 3 years without hearing from my parents, the first thing they finally gave me wasn't an apology. It was proof that walking away had been the smartest decision I ever made.